I just want to make something clear. It's very important. Vaccine or no vaccine, we're back.
Well, I feel about vaccines like I feel about tests. This is going to go away without a vaccine. It's going to go away, and we're not going to see it again.
Even without the vaccines, we're rounding the turn. It's going to be over.
And they'll hate this. Even without the vaccine, the pandemic's going to end. It's going to run its course. It's going to end. They go crazy. He said without the vaccine. Watch. It'll be a headline tomorrow. These people are crazy.
These are bad people. These are sick people we're dealing with. But to every COVID tyrant who wants to take away our freedom, hear these words: we will not comply, and we will not tolerate your vaccine mandates. I also believe in your freedoms 100%.
And you know what? I believe totally in your freedoms. I do. Bree, you got to do what you have to do. If you don't want to take it, you shouldn't be forced to take it. No mandates.
Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus. You know that, right? Coronavirus. They're politicizing it. They tried anything. They tried it over and over. They've been doing it since you got in. It's all turning. They lost. It's all turning. Think of it. Think of it. And this is their new hoax.
They hate it when I say it. You know, you turn on to this MSDNC and fake news CNN. All you hear is COVID, 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 COVID. That's all they put on because they want to scare the hell out of everyone.
With a pandemic, they're getting tired of the pandemic, aren't they? Getting tired of the pandemic. You turn on CNN, that's all they cover. COVID, COVID, pandemic, COVID, COVID, COVID. You know why? They're trying to talk everybody out of voting. People aren't buying at CNN, you dumb bastards. They're not buying it. That's all they talk about.
And you know, the more testing you have, the more cases. They say cases are up. Yeah, testing is up.
But now with the COVID, what we do, and you know, they keep talking about cases. You know why we have cases so much? Because that's all we do is test. If we cut our testing down in half, they'd say, well, they wouldn't say that, but cases would go down in half. $35,000 people on average die each year from the flu. Did anyone know that? 35,000. That's a lot of people. It could go to 100,000. It could be 27,000. They say usually a minimum of 27 goes up to 100,000 people a year die. And so far, we have lost nobody to coronavirus in the United States. If somebody has a really bad heart, and they're close to death, even if they're not, but they have a very bad heart and they get COVID, they put it down to COVID. And you know, doctors get more money and hospitals get more money. Think of this incentive.
Hydroxychloroquine?
I'm taking it, hydroxychloroquine.
When?
Right now, yeah. A couple of weeks ago, I started taking it. Because I think it's good. I've heard a lot of good stories. I mean, look at Regeneron for me. And by the way, we're going to make Regeneron available to anybody that feels they want it, need it. I'm working to make the antibody treatment I received available to anybody that needs it free. Free. It's going away anyway. We're rounding that curve. We're rounding that corner. We're going to get back to normal. We just want to be where we were 7 months ago.
Biden's lockdown would reduce life expectancy. You know, when you do these lockdowns like you are suffering through in North Carolina, you have a governor, depression, suicide, drugs, alcohol, and many other problems. And your kids want to go to school. They want to go. They have to go to school. I will open your schools. Biden will close your schools. And he'll keep them closed. I mean, these people, it's like crazy what's going on.
It's a choice between a Trump boom and a Biden lockdown. He wants to lock it down. He was saying the other night, we're not locking anything down.
Synopsis. In 2020, dark forces have gained far-reaching influence in human civilization, media, internet platforms, business, politics, police, military. For a theological reference, see Archbishop Carlo Vigano's letter to Trump in 2020 about the rise of forces of darkness. The majority of humans were in self-inflicted ignorance of this fact because it wasn't worth listening to conspiracy theorists since they are all stupid and crazy. The media, after all, said so, and football, reality TV shows, and video games, and whatever else were more interesting. And from this ignorance resulted responsibility. The majority of humans were blindly obedient to trusted science and authority and experts and not open to the arguments of their fellow humans. High-ranking politicians, real experts, and private activists who gave too deep an insight into the truth were murdered, suicided, fired, extremely censored, and socially ostracized and destroyed by both the system state and deep state and their fellow human beings. Under these life-threatening and politically and socially extremely difficult conditions, it was impossible to take an unbending position as a high-ranking politician without being assassinated, like the former president of Tanzania, John Magufuli, who suffered a heart attack. At the age of 60, politically destroyed or chased out of the country, like the former Brazilian president Bolsonaro, who had to flee into exile. One was forced to maneuver between perspectives and positions. Trump's role in the C19 scenario. At no time did Trump ever advocate mandatory vaccination. He always referred to it as a personal free choice, quite contrary to others who intended and politically campaigned to make vaccinations mandatory against people's free will. Trump has always said the pandemic will end with or without the vaccine. He repeatedly said that the vaccine was not necessary. Quite the opposite of others who insisted that the pandemic would not end until everyone was vaccinated and that it was everyone's social responsibility to get vaccinated to stop the spread and prevent family members from dying. 3. Therefore, he did not, as is often claimed, push the vaccine, implying an aggressive, obtrusive approach or offering any incentive to comply. He quickly but passively made it available to those who demanded it, told everyone directly that it wasn't even necessary, and promoted alternative cures. 4. Trump has said from the beginning and throughout that the infection numbers are the result of the testing numbers. The numbers have gone up because testing has gone up. This was very important to mention because the alleged number of infected was the same as the number of positive COVID test results. The COVID or PCR test is a fraudulent procedure that gives random positive results. There were no infection numbers. This was the core of the hoax. And exposing it was an attack on the pandemic narrative at its most vulnerable point. 5. Trump consistently promoted various alternative cures as an effective alternative to the vaccine, and he gave proponents of alternative cures a national, global platform, like Dr. Stella Manuel, who not only promotes alternative cures but also exposes demonic reptilian entities. 6. He portrayed the pandemic as harmlessly as possible, shattering its energetic, psychological, and emotional foundation. He called the pandemic, quote, the Democrats' newest hoax he called masks unnecessary. He compared C19 to the regular flu to put it all into a reasonable perspective. He described his own supposed C19 infection as, quote, feeling not so good for a few days, but nothing too bad, and this statement, coming from a senior citizen, also contributed to taking the scare out of it. 7. Trump was forced by external circumstances to operate between a powerful group that occupied many of the top positions in civilization that created the illusion of a deadly global health threat, and a majority of the population that was under the mind control of that same group and demanded salvation in the form of a savior vaccine. To summarize, Trump has done everything in his power to sabotage the hoax. All those who chose the so-called vaccine did so by their own ignorant choice. They were not forced into it by Trump, and it was not presented by him as a necessity or a social responsibility. No pressure or incentive. That's the most important part. Those who presented the vaccine as a necessity and responsibility and tried to make it mandatory were, and are the same ones trying to destroy him, the deep state. He repeatedly praised the rapid development of vaccines and even recommended it a couple of times to appease the unreasonable majority and satisfy both sides in order to survive politically. But political bragging and rare recommendations are easy to dismiss, carry little weight, and are relatively irrelevant as long as there is no physical or financial coercion and no presentation as a necessity or social duty while alternative cures are offered. As for Trump's recommendation of the vaccine, One, if the media and political syndicate attack him for everything but this recommendation because they can't, what does that say about the quality of the recommendation when the hated, distrusted establishment suddenly praises him for it because they must? Those who are critical of both the establishment and the vaccine have had their doubts reinforced. Those who have been successfully brainwashed to despise Trump usually reject everything he says out of programmed reflex. When they hear him endorse the vaccine they have been programmed to support, it creates a contradiction in their programming that cannot be logically resolved and could destabilize the programming. It might even cause them to agree with something else he has to say. 3. Trump could have chosen any format and setting for his vaccine recommendations, and yet he recommended the vaccine several times in front of a crowd of his public supporters where it was inevitable that at least a dozen would boo him. And that's exactly what happened every time. Had he refrained from publicly recommending the vaccine in front of his audience, there would have been no booing. And then none of the sections of the population who are only informed by the mass media would have had the opportunity to ask themselves, why are they booing? If even his loyal supporters are booing him for this, they must have serious reasons for it. The deep state is responsible. Trump is described by critics as the father of the C19 vaccine. But he is not, the deep state is. Trump appears as such because he has rushed the official development and distribution of it. What he really is the father of accelerating the official development and distribution of the C19 vaccine at warp speed. Those are two different things. The deep state would have been the father of the suppression of the official development of the C19 vaccine and the subsequent repeated mandatory vaccinations. Immediate mass availability of a vaccine was never intended because mass availability of the redemptive cure at the end of legitimacy for all control measures, which they wanted to massively expand and make permanent. Their often stated aim was to establish a new normal. Normality equals permanence, not temporary and forever continuing regular mandatory boosters, not a return to the old days as quickly as possible after a maximum of 2 to 3 vaccinations. The statements of the deep state chief scientist Fauci are evidence of this.
We'll be able to renew to a certain extent, but it's going to be different. Remember now, because this is not going to disappear.
Well, and don't you think, you talk about getting back to normal, don't you think what might help us as a society is accepting the fact that normal is never going to be exactly what it once was?
Well, I really like the way you put that. I'm going to plagiarize you later on in the day. And then it also depends on what you mean by normal. What does some form of normality mean?
Warpspeed was an act of compromise and a dilemma, an attempt to mitigate an inevitable greater crime. Trump made the best choice available to him. While the C19 hoax was a large-scale dark agenda operation, depopulation, nanoborg assimilation, dark energy parasitism, it was, in relative numbers, a small element within the dark medical industry that dispenses dozens of vaccines to humans, starting in infancy. Not to mention all the other drugs, these days there is hardly anyone who is not on medication. They are all tainted in one form or another. Chronic disease treatment in the U.S. is 5 times the cost of the nation's entire military budget. The same industry is behind the academic focus on finding cures for an ever-increasing number of diseases. This is intended to shift the focus from finding causes to treating symptoms and discovering cures, which the system does because it creates the causes through vaccines, drugs, GMOs, and chemicals in food, water, and air. This is why causal research is the great enemy of this system. Causal research is devastating to the dark medical complex. Under no circumstances do they want human attention to be focused on the causes. They only want funds for pharmaceutical drugs that relieve some pain with serious or even deadly side effects, actual intended effects, and funds for cure research that never accomplishes anything and intentionally so. The pandemic was a large-scale hoax, psychological warfare that created the illusion of a health threat and the vaccine. The concept as a means for immoral experimentation, harm, mutilation, sterilization, nanotechnological assimilation of humans into an internet of bodies, a Borg collective, and has been used successfully to some degree to kill millions of humans with criminal intent, cause chronic disease, and increase cancer rates by hundreds of %. Main purposes. 1. Dark psychological, sociological, and scientific experiments for various purposes. 2. Large-scale introduction of self-organizing extraterrestrial nanotechnology for mind and behavior control of the population. 3. Population reduction. 4. energy parasitic feeding of disease-induced misery, pain, and death by dark entities. Not all vaccine doses serve such a purpose fully or at all. To avoid pattern recognition by the targeted population and a resulting breakdown of trust in the controlled institutes necessary for the success of subsequent agendas, not all doses could be provided with highly concentrated or harmful substances. In addition, switching operations took place. At the local level, nurses and doctors apparently vaccinated thousands with saline solutions, as below, so above. At state, national, and global levels, similar operations are likely to have taken place, sparing millions of people from being injected with toxic substances and/or nanotechnology. The official number of deaths caused by the C19 biochemical weapon is currently around 30 million worldwide and possibly hundreds of millions of vaccine injured. Considering that, according to official figures, up to 70% of the world's 8 billion people have supposedly been vaccinated, this is a surprisingly low figure and suggests an outcome far below the expectations of the planners of Operation Pandemic. It is therefore quite possible that this is the result of a successful large-scale sabotage operation. The death cult's Operation C19 was probably the largest single crime in known human history. And the following assumption is admittedly speculative, but given the relatively low death toll and in the context of Trump's other policies, he may have used the power of the presidency to quickly produce and distribute an untainted or less critically tainted vaccine while he was still in power. Before he was predictably forced out of office and Biden then exclusively produced and distributed tainted vaccines. Apparently, some vaccine brands cause much higher adverse reaction rates than others, with AstraZeneca being the worst and Moderna, one of the brands promoted by Trump, being less harmful. There were probably numerous replacement and modification operations going on behind the scenes. They took place at the local level, with doctors and nurses vaccinating saline by the hundreds. It was below, so above, so there were probably switching operations where much larger quantities were exchanged. 30 million is approximately 0.54% of 70% of 8 billion. It is hard to believe that this was the intended number of the death cult. The Georgia Guidestone spoke reducing the population to 500 million. That is 6.25% of 8 billion, so 93.75% would have to be eliminated, not 0.54%. Before examining Trump's decision in detail, much has been said about what Trump did and did not do. Since you may be one of those who consider yourself capable of judging from afar, what would you have done had you been in his position? What exactly? The short version. 1. Tell the whole world the whole truth. A. Questionable whether that would have been possible at all, as the deep state's control system would likely have prevented it. B. There were those in high political positions who told part of the truth to some. Some of them were killed, suicided, others had coups directed against them as a result, probably assassination attempts on them. And that because they told a part of the truth. C. The entire control system would have branded you a dangerous conspiracy theorist and tried to remove you from office as quickly as possible, which would likely have succeeded. As a result, you would have been politically dead. D. The mind-controlled majority of the population would have rejected you from now on. The long version. 1. Telling the world directly to relax because it's all a hoax, that the virus and pandemic are pure fiction that only exist in computer models, fake statistics and made-up graphs, that a virus doesn't physically exist, that Fauci is a pathological lying reptilian, hiding behind a human silicone mask or hologram, and that the symptoms of the virus are a combination of normal flu enhanced by measures to weaken the immune system, an increasingly highly toxic civilization environment with bodies in a fragile balance that can easily tip, extreme stress, the nocebo effect, and hypochondriacal mass hysteria induced by 24/7 psychological warfare. In addition to a feeding frenzy of interdimensional vampire aliens attaching themselves to people's energy bodies and making them weak, sick, and gasping for air, operating under the guise of a pandemic. In addition to possibly hundreds of other opportunistic government experiments being conducted, and that the China lab story was a fabricated lie within a lie to manipulate the public into going along or even demanding war with China? Well, that would have all been pretty true, but would you have done that? It is highly doubtful that you would have been able to do this at all, because the degree of control that the control system has goes far beyond what most suspect and comprehend. What we know as fiction and theory is already invented and active. Upload filters are already in place. Certain words and phrases probably cannot even be uttered over internet and media channels or even microphones of major brands. There have been many incidents in the past that have given an insight into the true censorship capability of the control system, and it goes far beyond shadow banning on Facebook. The most famous is the Area 51 caller incident. It took exactly 2 minutes for them to notice the statements and shut down the radio station's satellite, and that was in 1997, almost 30 years ago. News articles and tweets about the public event of the Queen of England shape-shifting into a reptilian on a public stage in 2016 were deleted in real time. Seconds after they were posted, the tweets and associated accounts disappeared, and nothing has been heard from these witnesses since. The same procedure could be observed in the cases of the public shape-shifting of Justin Bieber, Adele, and Jay-Z. Some comments and articles appeared and disappeared very quickly. Researchers and activists in fringe areas are aware that they are being censored. However, they often do not make the connection with someone who has a far greater reach than them and is subject to the same censorship regime. Greater reach comes with greater censorship for deeper truths. Those who try to ignore this barrier and forcefully attempt to make deep truths public are stopped, noticeably and in some cases permanently. Officials in higher positions in politics, the military and intelligence services are apparently being briefed on what happens if they reveal too much. Operating in gray areas and pushing boundaries is one thing, crossing the line is another. If you make profoundly truthful statements publicly to an audience of millions, that is crossing the line, as you would have violated the world script and would be silently assassinated by the dark forces. Just as happened to several African heads of state who merely questioned the authenticity of elements of the pandemic narrative. The president of Tanzania, John Magufuli, was very likely assassinated because he revealed that the PCR COVID test was a fraud that also showed positive results on goats, papayas, and motor oil, and so on. He died shortly afterwards at the age of 60. President Lukashenko in Belarus, who declared that the global pandemic narrative was a psychosis and that there was no virus, was almost overthrown by a coup in the form of a color revolution, and suspected hit squads were prevented from entering the country by the intelligence service. Someone with a small reach can get away with disclosing certain information, deep truths not without some difficulty, but not someone who reaches millions. Theoretically, if you had sacrificed yourself to prevent the deaths of over 30 million people from vaccinations, you would have saved them if it had even been possible to get that message out, but then you wouldn't be around to prevent the estimated 3 billion future victims of World War III. Nor would you be around to prevent the possible total extinction of the human species on Earth under the artificial intelligence and alien invasion scenario that would inevitably follow World War III. The system would have defamed you ad infinitum as a danger to public health, as mentally ill as a conspiracy theorist lunatic, which would not only have meant your political end, but would also have damaged and suppressed any further questioning of events as staged. Because it would have associated a personified danger to survival with the questioning of official narratives. This is important to clarify, as most people are unable to distinguish between persons and ideas embodied by them. In the perception of these people, who are the majority, an idea is damaged when the person associated with it is damaged. The population captivated by the cult of scientism would have torn you to pieces and chased you out of the country. As mass psychology recognizes, the masses cannot be brought to reason. They behave like a purely emotion-driven animal that reacts with gut feeling and instinct, especially in situations that are perceived as dangerous to health or life. Trump's decision. The pandemic hoax was to manifest. It could not be prevented and it could not be stopped. Far too large a portion of the population was politically and scientifically illiterate, self-centered, ignorant, arrogant, weak-willed, unwilling to listen to warnings from fellow human beings, and therefore easy victims for the propaganda of far too powerful deceiver groups, deep state forces at the time. That these groups could become so powerful to begin with is a metaphysical contract made through willful criminal egotism, ignorance, and arrogance. The pandemic hoax was meant to last forever. The statements of the main culprits prove this, as they referred to it not as a crisis that will be overcome with great sacrifice, emphasis on sacrifice, but as the new normal. It was to be the new reality from then on, indefinitely. The leaders of the NWO medical syndicate said it would take years to develop a vaccine against the virus, where years is a euphemism for whenever we decide to end it, so never. Or rather, not until they had achieved total global control. The majority of the population was completely convinced of the need for a vaccine. Either driven by health fears, blind obedience to authority to politicians and priests of science and medicine, or unable to withstand social pressure. They relentlessly demanded a vaccine, they desperately hoped for it, they begged for it, they bribed to get it faster, they waited for hours in lines outside vaccination centers, they terrorized and discriminated and punished and fired and excluded anyone who disagreed with the official narrative. Even Christmas markets, churches, kindergartens, and homeless shelters kept their doors closed to the unvaccinated or those who refused to wear masks. A large part of the population belonged to one of these categories. The rest were at least obedient followers who went along, neither actively nor passively resisting. A few resisted, mostly passively and depending on the opportunity. A very small minority actively resisted and more or less saw through the propaganda. The majority were desperate for a vaccine, or at least saw a scientifically proven need for one, and would have fought or resisted anyone who would have denied them the saving vaccine for any reason. It was a train with no brakes, and Trump couldn't stop it. He couldn't deny the demanding masses salvation by vaccine. He could only try to set things in motion that would end the hoax quickly and prevent the new normal. From being stabilized, his only option was to accelerate the speed of the train and hope it would derail when it hit a curve at warp speed. And it did, but just barely. The system was unable to compensate sufficiently for the premature acceleration and the resulting pressure. It reacted too hastily and hostile and brutal. It overreached its improvised explanations and invented excuses, and brutality damaged its reputation, leading to a much more fierce resistance than a slow implementation would have done, as people tend to adapt to gradually escalating situations. The frog in hot water while reacting very aversively to sudden changes. Those who believe that the truth would have come out eventually anyway, and that everything would have gone back to normal, vaccine or no vaccine, that people would have eventually fought back in sufficient numbers, are deluding themselves because they are judging by their own standards. But these are the standards of a small minority of the population. The vast majority of the population was either fearful and desperate for the cure that would save them, or they were devout believers in authority, afraid of conflict or incapable of conflict. If there had been no vaccines, the result would have been global civil wars that would have escalated into even bigger wars. At the height of the pandemic hoax, we were at a point where corrupt governments around the world, especially in the West and China, were trying to introduce forced vaccinations. Vaccination passports and QR codes were already mandatory in trains, government buildings and stores, and RFID technology was already being promoted by the media as a superior upgrade. Third world countries dependent on supplies from first world countries were already experiencing mass deaths in the millions as supply lines almost collapsed. The military was already active in a supporting role and was about to be fully deployed on the streets to set up checkpoints and take control of the food supply. With an expected passive resistance of 10% of the population and an active resistance of 3%, this would have inevitably led to a civil war with government buildings in flames, looting, food shortages, and mass deaths. And all this in a situation where vaccines to cure the virus were available in mass quantities. Had they not been available, had Warpspeed not delivered them preemptively, despite Fauci and Drosten and all the other system operatives promoting the idea that a vaccine, they would take years to develop, then the pandemic hoaxers would have either won, or the casualties in the war that broke out between resistance and corrupt governments would have been in the millions with an uncertain outcome. Why wouldn't Trump admit that it was all a hoax and that the vaccines are harmful now that the hoax has been exposed? He couldn't then, but he always did. Now he can't, but does it anyway. Soon he will, but through others. It's complicated. That's what it's like when someone is forced to act torn between the majority of the population being deceived by lies and threatened and endangered by the objective truth, and the objective truth and what's best for everyone in the long run on the other side. Reasons why he couldn't. If he had taken the firm stand that vaccines are being misused by dark forces as vehicles for harmful and deadly substances and had refused to develop and distribute them, he would have been collectively attacked by science, medicine, psychiatry, the state, the media, the military, and the mind-controlled population. The majority. No politician can withstand such pressure politically. He would have been labeled as anti-science and a threat to public health, as well as a conspiracy madman and mass murderer through ignorance and negligence. He would have been impeached and successfully removed from office before the end of his term. Biden would have been put in office and he would have declared that it would probably only take 1 to 2 years to develop the saving vaccine. After 2 years, he would have said only 1 to 2 more years. The same game as with the lockdowns and masks. Just a little longer, just a little longer, just a little longer, just a little longer. And then they would very likely have achieved total control of the world. How he did it anyway. He called the pandemic a hoax. He did everything he could to conceptually attack and discredit the system's official pandemic narrative. He exposed all the main pillars of deception that support the narrative. The perception of threat, the legitimacy of testing, the hysteria of the media. He popularized alternative cures. He introduced the term alternative facts. He also said that the pandemic would end with or without vaccination. So he gave the fear-driven science cultists the savior vaccine they demanded, while letting the thoughtful and reasonable people know that it is not necessary and that there are even several alternatives. Trump called it a hoax, as did his family members, associates, political allies, and anonymous representatives used to informally communicate with the public. Several of them openly referred to the pandemic as a hoax, specifically using that word, reasons why he can't. 1. The nocebo effect works both ways. It makes the healthy believe that they are sick, which then manifests itself in reality by them actually getting sick or even dying due to the false belief that they are seriously ill. However, it can also make the sick believe that they are healthy, which then manifests itself in the fact that they are either cured or their illness loses its severity. There are many such cases that doctors cannot explain, that he says it is different from deep state agents saying it because they are not believed on a conscious or unconscious basis. By taking the position that the vaccines are safe, Trump is creating a positive nocebo effect for those who have been harmed by the vaccines. If Trump were to change his position and admit the harmfulness of vaccines, this alone would lead to mass deaths by neutralizing a positive nocebo effect where the sick realize they are sick and activating a negative placebo effect where the healthy believe they are sick. While his allies can be direct, he himself cannot. He must remain in place as an anchor of stability. Publicly declaring that he was allegedly deceived by Fauci and that the vaccines are harmful and downright deadly would also destroy him politically, rendering him incapable of preventing the outbreak of World War III. What is the greater harm? Do the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few? compared to the potential billions of deaths in a third world war. A few tens of millions of deaths and injuries from vaccinations are, well, less. Wow, he does it anyway. Trump has been and remained critical of vaccines all along. During Operation Pandemic, he was forced to appease the unreasonable, but he never called the vaccines a necessity, offered alternatives, and presented anti-vaccine advocates with alternative treatments. He supports vaccine critic Robert F. Kennedy. Was the videotaped conversation between him and Kenny staged? Perhaps it was a political maneuver, but the intention was good because he thus unofficially but publicly agreed with RFK's concerns. These are concessions and small steps to get the truth out in small doses to avoid shock. And now he has offered him a position in his administration, a man that calls the C19 vaccine the deadliest vaccine in history. Most importantly, Trump's support for research into the causes of disease will inevitably lead to vaccines being questioned as a cause, and as a result, not just the C19 vaccine, but all vaccines will be discredited, and not just all vaccines, but all tainted pharma medicine. Conclusion. Those who believe that the President of the United States is all-powerful and can single-handedly thwart the plans of the global dark forces if he only wanted to are often the same ones who claim that the President of the United States is merely a puppet of the dark forces. An absurd contradiction. This office is real and great power, but it is not omnipotent. Being under satanic alien rule that exerts extensive perceptual control over a largely submissive, passive, ignorant, and, on top of that, corrupted and collaborating population is not a request concert. One is forced to make the best of one's opportunities, and that is usually the lesser of two evils. It is not desirable, but it is realistic. You go ahead and try to prove otherwise by finding the morally flawless, all life-saving solution in an impossible situation. If you can do this, you will earn great respect and admiration because it is so unrealistic. But be encouraged to try. However, until you have found the perfect solution, be lenient with those who have tried.